Welcome back to another edition of Just Facts Combat. This week, we have a UFC Fight Night featuring Manuel Kape vs Almabayev, a card stacked with exciting flyweight matchups for the fans of the division. Kicking things off, we have the elusive Charles Johnson taking on heavy-handed knockout artist Ramos Temirov. Who am I backing? The savvy vet, Charles Johnson. Temirov is powerful but relies on darting into range to close the distance. While he does this fairly well, he leaves himself open for counters. That said, trading with him early is dangerous, at least for the first 5 minutes. However, I expect him to slow down after the opening round, as he hasn't fought past the first in 3 years. This is where Johnson should take over, potentially securing a late finish in the second or third round. That being said, I wouldn't be shocked if Temirov gets an early KO. Johnson has defensive flaws inside the pocket, often leaving his chin exposed, making the first round a dangerous one for him. Still, I believe his experience and fight IQ will allow him to weather the storm, drag Temirov into deep waters, and capitalize when he fades. Final prediction: Charles Johnson by TKO or decision. Two tough fighters going at it, but let's be real, a finish is highly unlikely, as both fight in a way that almost guarantees this goes to the judges. Once it does, I expect JJ Aldrich to get her hand raised. The key factor here is Andrea Lee's style. She moves forward with her hands low and often walks into shots without landing clean counters. She's also low volume on the back foot, which plays right into Aldrich's game. Aldrich excels at fighting off the back foot, stepping into the pocket to land shots before quickly resetting. This clash of styles favors her heavily. I see Aldrich outworking Lee and landing the cleaner strikes. While I don't expect much grappling, Lee may initiate it out of frustration when she struggles to land. However, Aldrich should be able to shrug off those attempts, as Lee isn't an offensive wrestler, she's more effective defensively. Final prediction: JJ Aldrich by decision. This should be a high-level boxing match, as both fighters have solid power and technique. While Silva has less experience than Almeida, I see him as the more complete fighter. Both are also huge for the weight class, making this an even tougher test for each other. Quick prediction: I've got Silva stopping Almeida in round 2 or 3. Both have defensive flaws, but Silva has the better chin and will press forward, forcing exchanges where he lands the harder shots. Almeida struggles on the back foot, meaning he'll likely absorb bombs his chin can't handle. That said, Silva isn't invincible. If he gets reckless, Almeida has enough power to rock him. Still, in a pure boxing battle, Silva has more tools to win. Final prediction: Silva by TKO, but a decision is also possible. I'll get straight to the point. Ramos is in for a tough fight. The key factor here is cardio. Mariscal fights at a relentless pace from start to finish, constantly applying pressure, which will be a nightmare for Ramos, who prefers a slower, more technical fight. We've seen Ramos struggle with cardio in the later rounds, and unless he scores an early finish, which is unlikely, I expect him to fade and get overwhelmed by Mariscal's aggression. On the ground, Mariscal's brutal ground and pound poses a serious threat. Ramos loves to play jiu-jitsu, but that could backfire, as he often leaves himself vulnerable. I can see Mariscal landing heavy shots, possibly cutting Ramos open if the fight goes there. I expect Mariscal to start fast, setting a pace that never allows Ramos to settle in. If Ramos gasses, a second or third round finish is possible. However, given his power, movement, and durability, I see this going the distance with Mariscal dominating everywhere. Final prediction: Mariscal by decision, with a chance of a late finish. This fight could either be a complete snooze fest or end in a finish. Pinto prefers to stay on the outside, picking his shots carefully while avoiding damage, whereas Lane, still developing his style, fights similarly but with more aggression and occasional wrestling. However, Pinto is the more skilled grappler, so if Lane wants to avoid ending up on his back, he'll likely be forced into a striking battle. Cardio and age are also major factors here. At nearly 40, Lane has likely hit his ceiling, while Pinto, at 25, is in his physical prime. I see Lane swinging wildly in the pocket and burning energy trying to secure takedowns that Pinto will defend. If this goes past the first round, Pinto should be much fresher, while Lane will start to fade, something we saw in his last fight, where he struggled to secure takedowns against an opponent with poor defense. Against Pinto, who wrestles at a higher level, that task will be even harder. That said, Pinto isn't flawless, he leaves his chin high and is hittable outside of his range management. Lane has knockout power and could land something big, but that feels like his only real path to victory. Overall, Pinto is the better fighter everywhere, and I expect him to win convincingly. Final prediction: Pinto by TKO or decision. This should be a barn burner between two tall, aggressive strikers in Barlow and Patterson. I'm siding with Barlow. I believe he's the better striker and the harder hitter. That said, Patterson carries respectable power and could capitalize on Barlow's tendency to leave his chin exposed. However, Patterson has even worse defense and is far more hittable. Barlow's elusiveness and range control make him a tougher target, whereas Patterson relies mostly on volume and range for defense. In the pocket, I see Barlow landing the cleaner, harder shots while taking less damage. If Patterson tries to grapple, I expect Barlow to fend off takedown attempts and keep the fight standing. Eventually, I see Barlow landing a crisp shot that hurts Patterson and finishing him. He's an excellent finisher, and if Patterson tries to brawl his way out, it'll likely end in a KO loss. Final prediction: Barlow by TKO in round 2 or 3. A decision isn't out of the question, and either fighter could land a fight-ending shot, but I'm leaning toward a Barlow finish. This is a classic front foot versus back foot matchup, with undefeated pressure fighter Hyder Amil facing the elusive William Gomis. Both are undefeated in the UFC and will fight hard to keep that status. Amil also carries a perfect 10-0 record, adding even more urgency to avoid his first career loss. That said, I see Gomis handing Amil his first defeat. His movement and style will make it difficult for Amil to apply his relentless pressure, which is his key to winning fights. If you haven't seen his last fight against Jang Lee, I highly recommend watching. It was short but easily the best fight of his career. In this matchup, I expect Amil to be countered frequently. He relies too much on his chin and toughness, assuming that as long as he can take a shot, he can land one back. Against Gomis, this approach will get him picked apart. Gomis won't trade after landing. He'll exit the pocket and reset, forcing Amil to chase. Amil will need to use kicks to slow Gomis down, but I see Gomis matching him in speed and movement. Wrestling could be an option for Amil, but I don't think he's good enough to take Gomis down and keep him there. In a striking battle, Gomis should be quicker, landing clean shots and evading before Amil can return fire. I see Amil falling behind on the scorecards while aggressively hunting for a finish, but ultimately, Gomis should control the fight. Final prediction: William Gomis by decision. A finish isn't out of the question. Amil could damage Gomis' legs enough to slow him down, or he could walk into a shot and get finished himself, but a decision is the safest bet. This is a banger of a fight, and I expect a high-level technical scrap. That said, I'm siding with Esteban Ribovics. Ribovics is the better pocket defender and arguably has the better chin, though not by much. Haqparast has defensive flaws that Ribovics can exploit. He constantly moves in one direction, even when exiting the pocket, and fights with his hands low, relying mostly on range for defense. While this could give Ribovics some trouble, I see him cutting Haqparast off and capitalizing on these predictable movements. I expect Ribovics to outwork Haqparast in the pocket, landing the cleaner shots and taking less damage with his high guard. Haqparast will likely bite down on his mouthpiece and trade at times, making for some wild exchanges, but overall, Ribovics should have the edge in volume and pressure. I don't expect much grappling, as both are primarily strikers. With that in mind, give me Esteban Ribovics by TKO or decision. This is a low-level middleweight fight and essentially a job eliminator, as both men are on losing streaks. The pressure is especially on Maruqez, who hasn't won since 2021 and has dropped 3 straight. Brundage, meanwhile, is coming off a controversial no contest against Al Hassan, where he was rocked before taking an illegal shot to the back of the head. While officially not a loss, he was clearly on the verge of being finished. It's laughable that this is the co-main over the Haqparast fight, but here we are. Given the matchup, I'm siding with Cody Brundage. Maruqez is dangerous early, but that's about all he has. Brundage can push a pace that Maruqez likely can't keep up with, forcing him into mistakes and leaving him open for takedowns. His takedown defense isn't terrible, but it's not great either. I expect him to stuff the first few shots but eventually get dragged down as Brundage wears him out. That said, if Maruqez can keep stuffing takedowns, Brundage could fade and get finished. This makes my pick shaky, and I wouldn't be surprised if Maruqez gets him out of there in the first 2 rounds. However, I see Brundage draining his gas tank before he can land a fight-ending shot. Final prediction: Cody Brundage by decision or late finish. Kape enters a flow state. He's at his best, and one of the most exciting fighters to watch. Stylistically, Almabayev is a tough but winnable matchup for him, as both prefer to fight on the outside, disrupting their opponent's rhythm with well-timed counters while staying elusive. Because of this, I expect a slow build-up early, with the action intensifying in the later rounds. This is where Kape starts to separate himself. As the fight progresses, Almabayev will begin to fall short on his strikes, overextend, and run into counters, struggling with Kape's speed and movement. I expect Almabayev to feel increasingly uncomfortable, forcing him to be more aggressive and likely push for takedowns. However, I believe Kape will have an answer for this, stuffing takedown attempts, especially as Almabayev starts telegraphing them with his strikes. Kape's movement and efficiency will likely be too much for Almabayev, who tends to rely on a similar game plan in every fight. Final prediction: Manuel Kape by decision, with a potential for a TKO.